3 hours had passed since the last shell exploded. In the cellar of a crumbling tenement in Remagen, Frau Kessler held her infant daughter so tightly she could sense the tiny heartbeat pulsing against her own chest. Rhythm pressed against rhythm through threadbare fabric and raw terror. Overhead, wooden supports moaned under impossible weight. Fine powder drifted downward in persistent streams, visible only where faint light penetrated the shattered foundation walls. Her hands shook violently, not because of the cold, though the temperature had dropped near freezing. She trembled because she knew what approached. The Americans were close now. Every woman throughout the Reich had absorbed the warnings. They'd been repeated for 12 unbroken years. The Ministry of Propaganda had crafted a singular narrative about the forces crossing the Atlantic. These liberators would be savages, men who would violate German women, slaughter German children, and incinerate whatever fragments of the fatherland remained standing. Dr. Goebbels had broadcast this certainty from every radio receiver across the nation. Yes, the Bolsheviks would surge westward with their Asian armies, but the Americans? They would arrive with their jazz records and chewing gum and their absolute contempt for European culture. They would transform Germany into a colonial outpost, a territory of enslaved people. This is what Frau Kessler had absorbed. This is what governed her beliefs as the first footfalls crunched across debris directly above her hiding place. The disintegration of Nazi Germany during the spring months of 1945 wasn't a singular event. It was a series of unfolding revelations. The military collapse was evident to anyone with functioning eyes. The Wehrmacht lay in fragments, the Luftwaffe had been grounded indefinitely, and cities across the nation had been reduced to lunar landscapes composed of pulverized brick and human remains. But another collapse was occurring simultaneously, one less immediately visible, yet equally catastrophic, the systematic dismantling of the ideological architecture that had propped up the Third Reich's claims to supremacy. For more than a decade, the Nazi state had constructed an elaborate mythology surrounding the alleged weakness and moral corruption of democratic societies, with particular emphasis on the United States. America was depicted as a mongrel civilization, compromised by racial integration, poisoned by Jewish corruption, and utterly incapable of producing soldiers who possessed the martial excellence of Germanic warriors. The propaganda apparatus had executed its mission with devastating thoroughness. By the time 1945 arrived, millions of Germans genuinely believed that falling into American hands meant not simply occupation, but complete extermination. The reality that would unfold in those spring months would demolish these convictions more thoroughly than any Allied bombing campaign ever could. On March 7, 1945, the 9th Armored Division achieved what military planners had considered impossible. They seized the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, intact and functional, spanning the Rhine. Within a single day, thousands upon thousands of American troops were flooding into Germany's interior heartland. The towns and cities beyond the Rhine had existed in a state of terrible suspension for weeks. They sat too distant from the front lines to justify evacuation, yet far too close to escape what was rapidly approaching. The civilian populations that remained consisted overwhelmingly of women, children, and the elderly. The men had either perished, been captured, or were still nominally serving in military units that existed more as bureaucratic fictions than actual fighting forces. What remained in places like Remagen, Koblenz, and the countless villages scattered between them were precisely the people propaganda had sworn to protect, but had instead completely abandoned. Frau Kessler detected voices filtering down from above, English, American English specifically. She recognized the cadence from forbidden films she'd watched before the war, back when such viewing was merely inadvisable rather than unthinkable. She pulled her daughter closer to her body. The child remained silent, too weakened by chronic hunger to produce cries, a mercy that felt like an additional curse. 3 months earlier, rations had been reduced again. Milk deliveries had ceased entirely. The bread had become more sawdust than actual grain. The infant had stopped gaining weight in January. Now, in March, she felt almost weightless in her mother's arms, as insubstantial as paper. The footsteps drew nearer. A flashlight beam sliced through the basement darkness, sweeping methodically across the faces of roughly a dozen women and children huddled together in the confined space. Frau Kessler closed her eyes. This was the moment. This was where the stories would be proven true. The light beam halted on her face. She heard a voice speak something in English. Then the light moved away. What unfolded next would remain etched in Frau Kessler's memory for the remaining 43 years of her existence. The American soldier who descended into that basement was Private Joseph Hendrickx, a 22-year-old from rural Pennsylvania. A farm boy drafted in 1943 who had come ashore at Omaha Beach the previous June. He had witnessed the war at its absolute worst, the hedgerows of Normandy, the frozen hell of the Ardennes forest, the devastated towns throughout the Rhineland. He had lost friends to German ammunition, German artillery, German landmines. He possessed every justification to hate these people. Command's official position was unambiguous. Don't fraternize, don't trust them. Remember what they've done. Yet when Private Hendrickx swept his flashlight across that basement and registered the condition of the civilians sheltering there, his immediate impulse wasn't vengeance. His immediate impulse was recognition. He saw hunger. He'd grown up during the Depression, understood intimately what it meant to wonder where your next meal would originate. He saw fear. He'd experienced it himself in hundreds of foxholes scattered across France and Germany. And he saw children, infants and toddlers with hollow eyes and swollen bellies, displaying the universal language of starvation. Private Hendrickx called up to his sergeant. Within 10 minutes, 3 additional Americans had climbed down into the basement. They had brought something Frau Kessler hadn't seen in months. Food, not German rations, which by March 1945 had become essentially theoretical. Not the bitter ersatz coffee or the gray bread that tasted of chemicals. The Americans brought chocolate bars, condensed milk, white bread, cheese, canned meat. They brought abundance. Private Hendrickx approached Frau Kessler with deliberate care, speaking in slow English, extending a can of condensed milk while gesturing toward her child. The woman didn't move. She'd been taught that accepting anything from the enemy constituted collaboration, perhaps even treason. But her daughter was dying, and propaganda cannot nourish an infant. She accepted the can.
The sergeant, a man named William Kowalski from Detroit, observed this exchange and then made a decision that would be replicated thousands of times across Germany in the weeks that followed. He ordered his men to assist in evacuating the civilians from the basement to a makeshift aid station the division had established in a partially intact church 3 blocks away. The building was structurally unsound. Another artillery barrage could bring the entire structure down at any moment. Better to relocate them now while there was a temporary lull in the fighting. Private Hendrickx reached toward Frau Kessler's daughter. The mother recoiled instinctively. The soldier maintained his hand extended, palm upward, patient. He was smiling, not with the satisfaction of triumph, but with something closer to gentleness. Frau Kessler studied his face, really studied it, and she saw something she had never expected to see in an American soldier: humanity. She placed her daughter in his arms. This moment, this simple transaction of trust, was being duplicated across the Western Front with a frequency that startled both the American troops and the German civilians they encountered. The mythology of the savage American liberator was colliding head-on with the reality of young men from Iowa and Texas and New York who had been raised to assist neighbors, who instinctively reached for a child in distress regardless of what uniform that child's mother might have once supported. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. How could these be the monsters Goebbels had warned about? How could these men who carried babies through rubble and divided their rations with enemy civilians be the same soldiers who were supposedly destined to enslave the German people? Private Hendrickx carried Frau Kessler's daughter through the ruins of Remagen with the same care he might have shown his own niece. The child, whose name was Greta, weighed almost nothing. The soldier could feel her ribs through the thin fabric of her dress. Behind him, other GIs were helping elderly women navigate the debris-strewn streets, carrying toddlers on their shoulders, offering arms to those too weakened to walk unassisted. This wasn't an organized humanitarian effort. There were no orders from Eisenhower to prioritize civilian comfort. It was something more instinctive, more fundamentally American, the conviction that if you possess the ability to help, you should help. The transformation this created in the German civilian consciousness was immediate and irreversible. Frau Kessler watched the American soldier carry her daughter to safety. And in that watching, an entire edifice of belief began to crumble. If they had lied about this, about the nature of the American soldier, what else had they lied about? If these were the enemy, what did that make the people who had promised to protect her but had instead left her to starve in a basement? The scenes unfolding at Remagen weren't isolated incidents. As American forces drove deeper into Germany throughout March and April 1945, they encountered civilian populations in varying states of crisis. The Allied bombing campaign had destroyed far more than military installations. It had demolished the infrastructure that sustained civilian existence. Water systems had collapsed entirely. Food distribution networks had ceased functioning. Medical supplies were non-existent. And the Nazi administration, in its final spasmodic death throes, had largely abandoned any pretense of concern for the people it claimed to represent. Local Nazi officials fled westward, often in commandeered vehicles, leaving behind the civilians they were supposed to govern to face the Allied advance with nothing but the propaganda that had sustained them and the growing awareness that it had all been fabrications. The American response to this humanitarian catastrophe wasn't uniform. There were incidents of violence, theft, and revenge. War brutalizes everyone it touches, and American soldiers were no exception to this rule. But what characterized the American occupation during those first chaotic weeks of spring 1945 wasn't cruelty. It was something closer to bewildered compassion. The GIs had anticipated fighting an enemy army. They hadn't anticipated finding themselves feeding enemy children. In the town of Eschweiler near Aachen, a combat medic named Robert Chen from San Francisco delivered 3 German babies in a single week, working in a basement clinic with whatever medical supplies he could scavenge. In Cologne, engineers from the 8th Infantry Division spent 4 full days repairing a water main that served a civilian neighborhood, work that had nothing to do with military objectives and everything to do with the fact that children were drinking from contaminated puddles. In dozens of small villages across the Rhineland, American mess sergeants found themselves doubling their cooking duties, preparing meals not just for their own troops but for German civilians who appeared at the perimeter of their camps, silent and starving. This wasn't official policy. The Allied plan for occupied Germany, such as it existed in March 1945, was fundamentally punitive. The Morgenthau Plan, though eventually rejected, had proposed reducing Germany to an agricultural state, stripping away its industrial capacity, ensuring it could never wage war again. The phrase, "no fraternization," was repeated in briefings and printed in field manuals. The Germans had initiated this war. The Germans had constructed the camps. The Germans had unleashed horrors upon the world that defied comprehension. They deserved no sympathy, no aid, no kindness. And yet, when Private Hendrickx carried little Greta Kessler to the aid station and placed her gently in the arms of an army nurse, he wasn't thinking about policy. He was thinking about a child who needed help. When the nurse, a lieutenant named Margaret Sullivan from Boston, examined the infant and found her severely malnourished and dehydrated, she didn't consult the fraternization guidelines. She started an IV line, administered glucose, and held the baby while she slept. Lieutenant Sullivan had 5 brothers, all of them serving in the military. She had witnessed what the Germans had inflicted in France. She had treated American soldiers bearing horrific wounds caused by German weapons. None of that altered the fact that the child in her arms was dying, and she possessed the knowledge to save her. Frau Kessler waited outside the church-turned hospital for 7 hours. She sat on a concrete block that had once been part of someone's home and stared at nothing. Other German women sat near her, equally silent. They had been conditioned to fear this moment, and now they were living it. And it bore no resemblance to what they had been told. The Americans had given them food. They had carried their children to safety. They had shown them something that 12 years of Nazi rule had nearly obliterated: mercy. When Lieutenant Sullivan emerged from the church at dusk, She located Frau Kessler and spoke to her through an interpreter, a German-American sergeant from Milwaukee named Ernst Miller, who had grown up speaking both languages. The baby would survive, the nurse explained. She needed rest and proper nutrition, but she would survive. Frau Kessler began to weep. The interpreter, Sergeant Miller, had witnessed this reaction before, German mothers confronted with American kindness, unable to reconcile it with everything they had been taught. He had grown weary of explaining that most Americans didn't hate Germans. They hated Nazis, and they understood these weren't always identical categories. He had grown weary of serving as the bridge between two worlds that should never have been at war, but he was patient with Frau Kessler. He told her that her daughter would receive care, that the Americans would provide formula and medicine, that she should rest and try to eat something herself. The woman looked at him with an expression he would never forget. It wasn't gratitude, though gratitude was present. It wasn't relief, though relief was there. It was something closer to fundamental bewilderment, the look of someone whose understanding of reality has just been shattered and who is attempting to comprehend what will replace it. The symbolic significance of that condensed milk that first Private Hendrickx had offered in the basement cannot be overstated. For years, Germans had been told that America was a land of poverty and chaos, a failed experiment in democracy where people existed in squalor and racial violence. The reality the Wehrmacht had encountered in France told a vastly different story. The equipment the Americans brought to Europe, the vehicles, the weapons, the supplies, spoke to an industrial capacity that dwarfed anything Germany could produce. But it was the small items that truly revealed the chasm between propaganda and reality. The chocolate bars that every American soldier seemed to carry, the cigarettes, real tobacco, not the sawdust substitutes Germans had been smoking, the canned goods, the fresh bread, the coffee that actually tasted like coffee.
These weren't luxuries reserved for officers. These were standard rations for every private in the American Army. The abundance was staggering. Germany, which had prided itself on efficiency and organization, had been rationing food since 1939 and had been slowly starving its own civilian population to feed its military machine. America, which the Nazis had dismissed as weak and disorganized, was feeding both its own massive army and increasingly the civilians of its defeated enemy. The contrast couldn't have been more stark, and for Germans who had believed in the superiority of their system, it was devastating. By late March 1945, the pattern had become unmistakable across the American zone of occupation. The 9th Armored Division alone estimated it had provided emergency rations to over 20,000 German civilians in the first 2 weeks after crossing the Rhine. The 1st Infantry Division established feeding stations in Bonn and the surrounding villages, serving hot meals to anyone who appeared. The 3rd Armored Division detailed entire platoons to assist with medical care for civilians, work that diverted them from military duties, but which commanders deemed necessary both for humanitarian reasons and for maintaining order. A starving, desperate population was a dangerous population. Better to feed them, the reasoning went, than to face an insurgency born of desperation. But the motivation ran deeper than pragmatism. The average American GI in Germany in 1945 came from a culture that valorized individual initiative and community responsibility. They had been raised during the Great Depression by parents who remembered what it meant to go hungry and who had survived through a combination of government assistance and neighbors helping neighbors. They had been taught, consciously or not, that America's strength came not from racial purity or military discipline, but from its diversity, its democratic institutions, and its fundamental belief that people possessed a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. These weren't abstract concepts. They were lived values. And when the GIs encountered civilians in distress, these values guided their actions more powerfully than any military directive ever could. The German civilians noticed. Of course they noticed. How could they not notice when the behavior of their conquerors contradicted everything they had been taught about conquest? When German forces had occupied France, Belgium, Poland, the Soviet Union, they had not carried children to safety. They had implemented policies of deliberate starvation. They had rounded up populations for forced labor, or worse. They had made a philosophy of cruelty. The Americans brought chocolate bars. Frau Kessler was not a Nazi. She had never joined the party, had never attended a rally, had never raised her arm in salute with any real conviction. She had been a school teacher before the war, teaching literature and history to children who had been required to begin each day singing the Horst Wessel lied. She had taught the curriculum she was given and had kept her doubts to herself, because voicing doubt meant risking everything. Her husband had been drafted in 1942 and sent east. She had received 3 letters from him, the last one dated November 1943, postmarked from somewhere near Smolensk. After that, silence. She had raised Greta alone, had watched her country destroy itself, and had waited for the end that everyone knew was coming. When that end arrived in the form of Private Joseph Hendrickx from Pennsylvania, it was nothing like she had imagined. The young soldier who carried her daughter to safety became, in her mind, the symbol of everything the Third Reich had lied about. He was not a monster. He was a farm boy who missed his mother and who could not walk past a suffering child without attempting to help. He represented a kind of power that Germany had never understood, the power of a nation built on the idea that all people, even your enemies, possessed inherent dignity. This realization spread through the German civilian population like a slow-moving wave throughout the spring and summer of 1945. As American occupation became a daily reality rather than a feared prospect, as the predicted atrocities failed to materialize and were replaced instead with feeding programs, medical care, and the slow reconstruction of civil society, the mythology of Nazi superiority collapsed under the weight of observable truth. The Americans were not perfect occupiers. There were abuses, crimes, failures of policy and implementation. But compared to what Germans had been led to expect, and more damningly, compared to what German forces had done in occupied territories, the American presence was marked by a restraint and humanity that made a mockery of 12 years of propaganda. By May, when Germany formally surrendered, Frau Kessler had gained back 15 pounds. Her daughter had tripled her weight and was learning to crawl in the displaced persons center the Americans had established in what had once been a Wehrmacht barracks. The war was over, but the transformation it had wrought in the German consciousness was just beginning. Every German who had been helped by an American soldier, every child who had been fed, every mother whose baby had been carried to safety became a witness to the lie they had been living under. The Reich had promised them greatness and delivered ruin. The Americans, whom they had been taught to fear and despise, had shown them mercy. The chocolate bar became the symbol of this transformation. It appeared in countless accounts from that period. German children approaching GIs with a mixture of fear and hope. Americans reaching into their pockets to produce the small brown bars with their distinctive wrappers. Hershey's chocolate, that most American of products, became synonymous with liberation in a way that no weapon ever could. It represented abundance, yes, but also something deeper, generosity. The Americans did not need to share their rations with German children. They did it because they chose to, because their culture had taught them that this was what decent people did. The contrast with Soviet occupation in Eastern Germany made the American approach even more striking. As the Red Army pushed into Germany from the east, it brought with it a justified rage for what the Wehrmacht had done in the Soviet Union. The result was a wave of violence and retribution that German civilians in the Soviet zone experienced with the full horror that propaganda had predicted, though for different reasons than Goebbels had claimed. The Americans in the West were different, not because they were morally superior human beings, but because they came from a different culture with different values, and because they had not endured the same level of devastation that the Soviets had suffered at German hands. The division of Germany into occupation zones created a natural experiment in governance and ideology. In the Soviet sector, the occupation was harsh and extractive. Factories were dismantled and shipped east as reparations. Food was requisitioned. The civilian population lived in fear of Soviet soldiers and Soviet administrators alike. In the American sector, by contrast, the occupation evolved rapidly from punitive to reconstructive. The GIs who had carried babies to safety in March were joined by civil affairs officers, reconstruction specialists, and eventually, through the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars in aid designed to rebuild rather than punish. The German civilians in the western zones noticed the difference immediately. Frau Kessler had cousins in Brandenburg in the Soviet zone. The letters that occasionally made it through told stories that made her grateful, despite everything, that the Americans had arrived first. Her cousin Helga wrote of Soviet soldiers who took what they wanted without asking, of a command structure that seemed to view German civilians as legitimate targets for revenge, of a hopelessness that pervaded daily life. In contrast, Frau Kessler could walk to the American mess hall each morning and receive a hot meal. She could take her daughter to the American medical clinic for checkups. She could see with her own eyes American engineers working to restore electricity, to repair roads, to make life livable again. This created a cognitive shift that went beyond mere gratitude. It created a fundamental reorientation toward democracy in the West.
The Germans in the American zone began to understand that their survival and eventual prosperity were linked to the very system they had been taught to despise. Democracy had not made America weak. It had made America strong enough to not only win the war, but to rebuild its enemies afterward. The free market had not created chaos. It had created the industrial abundance that now fed German children. Individual liberty had not led to social breakdown. It had produced citizens who voluntarily helped those in need, even when those in need were enemy civilians. Private Hendrickx wrote home to his parents in Pennsylvania in April 1945, trying to explain what he had seen and what he had done. "I carried a German baby to the hospital today," he wrote. "She was starving. Her mother looked at me like she thought I was going to hurt them, but I just wanted to help. I kept thinking about Mary's kids back home. Kids are kids, I guess, no matter what side their parents were on. This whole thing is crazy. We're supposed to hate these people, and I do hate what their army did. But when you see them up close, they're just scared and hungry and tired. Just like us, I guess, except they lost and we won. I'll be glad when I can come home." That letter, preserved in a collection at the U.S. Army Heritage and Education Center, captures the essential ambivalence of the American occupation. The GIs were not naive. They knew what the German war machine had done, but they also retained the capacity to see individual Germans as individual humans, a distinction their enemy had systematically failed to make when dealing with occupied populations. This was the fundamental difference between the two systems. One had been built on the belief that some people were inherently superior to others, and thus entitled to brutalize those deemed inferior. The other, for all its flaws and contradictions, maintained at least the aspirational belief that all people possessed equal worth. The impact of this philosophy on German civilians was profound and lasting. Frau Kessler would live until 1988, long enough to see Germany reunified and to watch her daughter raise children of her own in a prosperous, democratic West Germany. In interviews conducted by historians in the 1970s and 1980s, she consistently returned to that moment in March 1945 when Private Hendrickx had reached for her daughter. "That was when I knew it was all lies," she said. "Everything they had told us, everything we had believed, lies. The Americans were supposed to be our enemies, and they saved my child's life. What does that make the people who told us to fear them?" This was the question that haunted Germany in the aftermath of the war. The physical reconstruction was difficult enough. The cities had to be rebuilt. The economy had to be revived. The population had to be fed and housed. But the psychological reconstruction was perhaps even more challenging. An entire nation had to come to terms with the fact that they had been systematically lied to, that they had supported a regime built on hatred and lies, and that their supposed enemies had shown them more humanity in defeat than their own leaders had shown them in victory. The American soldiers who participated in these small acts of mercy during the spring of 1945 did not think of themselves as agents of ideological transformation. They were simply doing what seemed right in the moment. But collectively, these actions, the caring of babies, the sharing of food, the provision of medical care, accomplished what no amount of propaganda or re-education programs could achieve. They demonstrated in practical, undeniable ways the difference between a system built on human dignity and a system built on human degradation. The process of denazification, the formal Allied program to remove Nazi ideology from German society, was often heavy-handed and imperfect. Questionnaires were filled out, party members were identified and sometimes prosecuted, symbols were banned and monuments destroyed, but the real denazification happened in moments like the one Frau Kessler experienced in that basement. It happened when observable reality contradicted propaganda so thoroughly that the propaganda simply collapsed. It happened when a German mother placed her dying child in the arms of an American soldier and discovered that mercy was real, that kindness existed even in war, that the enemy was human after all. The transformation was not instantaneous or universal. Some Germans retreated into bitter nostalgia for the Reich, refusing to accept responsibility for what had been done in their name. Some clung to anti-Semitism and hatred even as their cities were rebuilt with American assistance. But for millions of Germans, particularly those who had direct contact with American forces in those early months of occupation, the change was undeniable. They had seen with their own eyes that democracy worked, that diversity created strength rather than weakness, that a nation built on individual liberty could be more powerful, more prosperous, and more humane than any authoritarian state. By summer, American military government had established formal programs to address the humanitarian crisis in occupied Germany. The Army began distributing food on a systematic basis, established hospitals, and started the long process of rebuilding infrastructure. But these official programs were built on the foundation of those first spontaneous acts of compassion in March and April. The German civilians who lined up for American rations in June had already been prepared by the experiences of March. They had already learned that Americans could be trusted, that the democracy they represented offered something more substantial than the authoritarianism that had promised them greatness and delivered catastrophe. The milk that Lieutenant Sullivan used to save little Greta's life came from Wisconsin dairy farms, processed in American factories, and shipped across the Atlantic in American merchant vessels protected by American warships. It represented a supply chain of staggering sophistication, an industrial and logistical capacity that Germany, even at the height of its power, had never possessed. But more than that, it represented a choice. America could have let German children starve. Some argued they should. Instead, American taxpayers funded the shipment of millions of tons of food and medical supplies to feed the people whose army had just spent 6 years trying to destroy civilization. This was not weakness. This was not naivete. This was power, the power of a nation secure enough in its values to show mercy to its defeated enemies, confident that those values would ultimately prove more durable than any military victory. The Nazi system had been built on the idea that might makes right, that the strong were entitled to dominate the weak. The American response to German defeat was a repudiation of that philosophy. It said quietly but firmly that strength should be used to protect, not to destroy. That victory imposed obligations, not just opportunities. That the true measure of a civilization was how it treated those who could not defend themselves. Frau Kessler understood this, though she might not have articulated it in these terms, as she held her daughter in the Displaced Persons Center in the summer of 1945, as she listened to American jazz playing on a GI's radio and ate American white bread that tasted like a miracle after years of ersatz rations. She understood that something fundamental had shifted. The world she had known, the world of the Reich and its promises of greatness, was gone forever. What would replace it remained uncertain. But if the Americans were any indication, it would be built on different principles. It would be built on the idea that a soldier could carry an enemy's child to safety, and that this was not a betrayal of his duty, but an expression of it. The summer of 1945 brought its own challenges. The war in Europe had ended, but millions of displaced persons clogged the roads and railways, searching for homes that no longer existed or family members who had not survived. The American occupation forces found themselves administering a humanitarian crisis of unprecedented scale. but the foundation of trust that had been established in those first weeks proved invaluable. German civilians cooperated with American authorities because they had learned that cooperation led to aid, not punishment. They registered with occupation officials because they had learned that the Americans could be trusted to treat them fairly. They began the long, painful process of confronting what had been done in their name because they had seen firsthand that another way was possible. Greta Kessler would grow up with no memory of that March day when an American soldier had carried her to safety. But the story was told to her repeatedly throughout her childhood, became part of her family's mythology, shaped her understanding of the world. She would become a teacher like her mother, would raise 2 sons in the Federal Republic of Germany, would live to see the Berlin Wall fall and Germany reunite. And she would tell her students about the day she was saved, about the soldier from Pennsylvania who had shown mercy when he had every reason not to, about the lesson that moment taught, that civilization is fragile, that cruelty is easy, but that kindness requires courage, and that courage can change the world.
The epilogue to this story played out over decades. West Germany became a democracy, a close ally of the United States, an economic powerhouse rebuilt with American assistance through the Marshall Plan. The generation that had lived through 1945, that had experienced the collapse of the Nazi state and the unexpected mercy of the American occupation, became the generation that built the new Germany. They remembered. They taught their children to remember not just the horrors of what they had supported, consciously or through silence, but also the lesson of what real strength looked like when exercised with restraint and guided by values. Private Joseph Hendrickx returned to Pennsylvania in December 1945. He went back to farming, married his high school sweetheart, raised 4 children, and rarely spoke about the war. When he did not talk about the battles, or the fear, or the friends he had lost. He talked about the German mother in the basement and her baby who had weighed nothing at all. He talked about how strange it had been to be feared and then trusted, how much it had meant to see that child survive. In 1982, a German documentary crew tracked him down. Working from Frau Kessler's memories and American unit records, they found him and asked him why he had helped. He looked confused by the question. "What else was I supposed to do?" he said. "She was a baby. You help babies." That answer, in its simplicity, captured something essential about the American character that Nazi ideology had never understood. The Reich had believed that democracy made people weak, that diversity made societies unstable, that mercy was a luxury only the powerful could afford. Private Hendrickx proved them wrong. He was not weak. He had survived Omaha Beach, had fought through France and Germany against an enemy that had given no quarter, but he had retained the capacity for compassion, the instinct to help rather than harm. That was not weakness. That was strength of a kind the Third Reich had never comprehended. The babies carried to safety in the spring of 1945 grew up in a Germany transformed. They became doctors and teachers, builders and artists, mothers and fathers themselves. They lived in a country that had learned, through the most catastrophic failure imaginable, that authoritarianism led only to destruction, and that democracy, for all its messiness and contradictions, offered something better, the possibility of dignity, the promise of choice, the hope that mercy might triumph over cruelty. And when they told their own children and grandchildren about the war, some of them told the story of the American soldiers who had carried them to safety, who had given their mothers food and medicine, who had shown them that the world did not have to be built on hatred. These stories became part of the fabric of German memory, a counterweight to the shame and horror of what the Reich had done. They were not excuses. Nothing could excuse the Holocaust, the aggressive wars, the deliberate cruelty of the Nazi state. But they were reminders that even in humanity's darkest hours, even in the ruins of a civilization that had chosen evil, small acts of decency remained possible. And sometimes those small acts, a soldier carrying a baby through rubble, a nurse saving a child's life, a can of condensed milk offered without demand for payment or gratitude, could plant the seeds of something better. The mothers who wept in the spring of 1945 wept for many reasons. They wept for what they had lost: husbands, homes, the illusion of righteousness. They wept for what they had learned, that they had been deceived, that the enemy was not who they had been told. They wept from relief that their children would survive, and from shame that it had taken conquest to teach them what their own government had tried to destroy. That mercy was not weakness, that diversity was not degradation, that the measure of civilization was how you treated those who had no power to demand better treatment. In the end, the story of German mothers weeping as American soldiers carried their babies to safety is not a story about American virtue or German wickedness. It is a story about the collision of two systems, one built on the belief that some humans were inherently superior to others, and one built on the aspiration, however imperfectly realized, that all humans possessed equal dignity. When those systems met in the ruins of Germany in 1945, the outcome was never really in doubt. The question was only how much destruction would occur before the lesson was learned. The babies survived, most of them anyway. They grew up in the shadow of their parents' choices and their nation's crimes. But they also grew up in a world where an American soldier had once stopped in the middle of a war to help a child who was not his own, who belonged to a nation he had every reason to hate. That memory, repeated thousands of times across Germany in the spring of 1945, became a foundation, not for forgetting what had happened, that could never be forgotten, but for building something different, something better. The chocolate bars and condensed milk are long gone. The soldiers who distributed them are mostly gone too, their generation passing into history. But what they represented remains. The idea that abundance should be shared, that power should be exercised with restraint, that even your enemy's children deserve compassion. These were not uniquely American values, but America in that moment chose to embody them, and in doing so, it won a victory more lasting than any military conquest. It won the peace, it won the future. It proved that democracy, for all its flaws, offered something authoritarianism could never provide: the freedom to choose mercy over cruelty, generosity over revenge, hope over despair. Frau Kessler died believing that her daughter had been saved by an act of grace in a graceless time. She was right. But the grace was not miraculous or divine. It was human, which made it all the more remarkable. In the spring of 1945, in the ruins of a failed empire, young men from a distant democracy carried babies to safety because it was the right thing to do. And in doing so, they demonstrated a truth that 12 years of Nazi propaganda could not erase: that the strength of a nation lies not in its capacity for violence, but in its commitment to human dignity, not in its ability to dominate, but in its willingness to lift up even those who have fallen furthest. That is what the mothers wept for in the end. Not just for their children's survival, but for the recognition of what survival meant. It meant that the world they had known was gone, but that the world to come might be built on better foundations. It meant that mercy was real, that kindness was possible, that even in the midst of total war, humanity could reassert itself. It meant that democracy was not weakness, but strength, that diversity was not decay, but renewal, that the future belonged not to those who preached hatred, but to those who practiced compassion. The babies carried to safety became the builders of that future, and the soldiers who carried them went home, modest and silent, content in the knowledge that they had done their duty, not just as soldiers, but as human beings. That, perhaps, is the final lesson of that terrible spring, that duty and humanity need not be in conflict, that the warrior and the caregiver can exist in the same person. That victory means nothing if it is not tempered by mercy. In the end, the chocolate bars mattered more than the tanks. The condensed milk did more to win the peace than all the artillery in Europe. And the image of an American soldier carrying a German baby through the ruins became a symbol not of conquest, but of redemption, the possibility that even out of history's greatest catastrophe, something decent could emerge. That was the gift those young Americans gave to Germany in 1945, whether they knew it or not just survival, but hope, not just liberation, but the chance to build something better. And when the German mothers wept, they wept for all of it: the past that was lost, the future that might be gained, and the unexpected mercy that made the transition possible.